So hi, I'm Elizabeth. If you don't mind being recorded, sometimes when I talk, it'd be nice to pop your face in just so I know that you're not all slumped over, passed out in your seats. But I understand. Um, so the first thing I'm going to tell you, I'm going to reshare the link. I'm giving you a handout, which is really, it's a rough outline of a lot of the information I have in here. I don't really want you to try to look at it while we're talking. It's more of an assurance for you that you don't have to sit there and try to write down all these years and all these names of laws and everything. It's so that you have something to refer to. Now, what I will tell you I have in it is any images that I use in the presentation have a little 2 or 3 letter location code at the end. And the handout has what all those location codes correspond to. So if you see something you want to look at later, I call them the source codes. And it also has what I call the players, which is the cast of characters we're going to be dealing with. So you will not remember everything I tell you in this class. There's no way. I have simplified significantly everything that is going on in the English Reformation. One of the choices I have made is I am going to talk about people by their given names, not usually their titles, because they keep shifting. We're just going to call the Pope, regardless of which one we're talking about, because there's about 18 different popes in the 16th century. So nearly every time I say, and then the Pope sent a letter that said this, it's a different Pope than the last time I said the Pope did this. So if it sounds like the Pope is inconsistent, that's because it's usually not the same guy. So I tried to cut it down to here are the relevant popes and just then later went, no one deserves that. I listed in the cast of characters the more relevant popes if you really want to know. There are popes who literally wrote one letter having to do with the English Reformation and keeled over and died. So by the time the letter gets there, that pope's already not there and it doesn't apply. So I don't want you to remember everything, but I do want you to keep in mind this sense of chaos and confusion that I'm going to try to take you through. Because the reason I teach this class and the reason I developed it is to try to help people understand what it would have been like to live in such a chaotic time. I got into this, I actually researched prayer beads. And I get a lot of questions about, oh, well, would my persona have still used prayer beads and didn't they go away with the Reformation? And the answer I kept finding was it's complicated. So I wanted to dig deeper into what makes it complicated. So what I want to demonstrate in here is the chaos and confusion. I also want, if you are familiar with the Continental Reformation, I want to demonstrate to you that how England is different, both just because of geography. They are not near the Pope in nearly the same way that that continental Europe is. They're starting from a different place. We'll talk very briefly about what's going on in the continent and all the issues with corruption that we've all heard about if we grew up learning about the Reformation. There is not the same evidence in England of a lot of corruption and problems that there necessarily were that Luther was dealing with in the German-speaking areas of Europe. It is a slower process in England. So with that, I am going to share. And I have lots of pictures because let's face it, this is a little dry. So I think I have to share and then go full screen. And once I'm full screen, I think most of you know I won't be able to see the chat, but I have Elizabethe here to help me out with that. So share my screen. Oh gosh, I've opened a lot of other things today now too. Okay, and then let me take this to full screen. All right, can everybody see something that says the English Reformations? Excellent. So there is my email address. I'm also easy to find. Look on the Pelican or Laurel Roll of Honor. I am not an expert on the English Reformation. The English Reformation is, to English historians, what something like the Civil War is to American historians. They never stop writing about it. There are people who dedicate their entire lives to studying it. And they've had a couple hundred more years to spill ink. So there is a ton of information out there, and there are active historical debates over exactly how people experienced it and what they were thinking and why they were thinking that way. So I'm going to give you my best shot at interpreting that based on what I've read and understand. So again, these are also in the handout, but just to give you an idea of the source codes of where I'm getting the information for my images. So let's complicate it more, because who doesn't love complexity? First of all, there are a number of historians who argue that calling it the English Reformation is incorrect, because there's really 3 Reformations that occur in England. And it sounds more complicated, but when you think about it, and as we go through it, it actually does make sense. So they divide up the Reformation into 3 different parts, 2 of which were reversed. So first of all, you have the Henrican Reformation. So this is the stuff that happens under Henry VIII. And it largely happens in the 1530s. And then most of that is undone. Henry even undoes some of it himself. Then you have the Edwardian Reformation, which is what occurs during the regency of his son, Edward VI. And that is 1547 to 1553. But a lot of that is undone because when Edward dies, his sister Mary takes the throne. And they refer to her era as the Marian Restoration, where she gets right to work taking apart everything her brother just did. And then the third Reformation, and the one that actually sticks, is the Elizabethan Reformation, which really a lot of the legislative portion of it is done pretty early in her reign. But we will go deeper to talk about some of the aftermath. And the Elizabethan Reformation is the one that isn't really reversed. And when I'm talking about these, I am not going to go deeply into the doctrinal differences because we don't have that kind of time today. And I don't have that kind of expertise. But to really understand the Reformation, we actually have to step in the Wayback Machine a little further. So the first Reformation is the Henrican Reformation. This is under the reign of Henry VIII. But during the time of Henry VIII, what they referred to his whole desire for an annulment, divorce, was the king's great matter. So to understand the king's great matter and how we get here, we have to go further. And that is to remember that Henry is the second son of Henry VII. And this is where the players might come in handy on your handout. So what you need to remember is Henry VIII is raised as the spare of the heir and a spare. So in 1501, Henry's older brother, Arthur, who is the Prince of Wales, marries the Spanish princess, who we will come to know as Catherine of Aragon. And the next year, Arthur dies. So Henry VII goes, well, gosh, we had this whole alliance worked out. We kind of like this Spanish princess. She's working out well for us. We don't want to lose her. And goes to the Pope and says, hey, I want a dispensation to marry my second son to my first son's widow. So one of the reasons that all of this stuff comes about is actually a theological debate. So the Bible is actually contradictory on the question of what your relationship should be to your brother's widow. The more popular view of it at this time is the interpretation from Leviticus that forbids you from marrying your brother's widow. Hence why Henry VII gets a dispensation from the Pope to betroth Catherine to Henry. So remember this, because this is going to come up again decades into their marriage. So Henry is engaged to, and then about the time he becomes king, marries his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. 1509, Henry becomes king. In 1517, as one of the other people in here alluded to when we were chatting before the class, in continental Europe, you have the start of the Reformation. You have Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door. And Protestant ideas do make their way over to England while this is going on, but they're actually suppressed, particularly by the young Henry VIII, to the point where in 1521, the Pope at the time actually awards Henry the title Defender of the Faith. He'll be rolling in his grave in a few years. But so how do we get from Henry, Defender of the Faith, to Henry, I'm going to split from the church? Well, Henry is obsessed with getting himself a male heir. And this isn't crazy. This isn't out of line. This fits with the culture he's living in. By the way, Henry wants to call it an annulment everywhere. Everybody else knows it's a divorce. But Henry keeps asking for an annulment. So why suddenly in the 1520s and into the 1530s does Henry become more and more concerned with the fact that he doesn't have a legitimate male heir, and that eventually kicks off this whole English Reformation? Well, first of all, So by the time Henry is really starting to really panic about this, he and his wife, Catherine, only have had one successful pregnancy. And what I mean by that is she's had stillbirths, she's had miscarriages. Their only child that has survived infancy and lived to a decent age is their daughter, Mary. By the time Henry's really obsessing over a son, Catherine hasn't been pregnant in 7 years. She's probably not giving him another healthy child. Why is this such a big deal to him? Well, it is the culture we're in. This is a male preference primogeniture society. The eldest male inherits. And that's not just based on superstition. Our little bit of experience that we have in England of women as rulers isn't really promising. In the 12th century, we did briefly have Matilda, Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I, try to take power. She's never actually even crowned, though she gets called the Lady of the English. And there's a massive civil war. And there's all kinds of chaos and confusion. It causes all kinds of problems. And there's not too many examples of women rulers that we can look out to in the other European countries. So there's a legitimate fear of, we're not used to women ruling. We're not sure this is going to work out. The other thing is that not just women being weak, but we know what the history is of young rulers. Remember, Henry may not have in his living memory the Wars of the Roses, but Henry's father came to power out of civil war. And as an excellent, this is a little fuzzy, but I love this demonstration. So you see these red dotted lines that go back and forth across here. Those red lines are all the times that people are being deposed. And the green line is when we finally defeat someone. So in memory of the older people that Henry is dealing with, we have had an experience of civil war and rulers being overthrown, as well as, things like down here in the one area, here's the marker for Edward V, who never even gets to be crowned because he disappears from the tower. So Henry is worried. He doesn't want to take the risk of not having a son really soon that he could leave the throne to. The other thing Henry is dealing with, if he doesn't produce this son, is the other claimants to the throne. Now, I throw this family tree in now, but you're going to want to remember it for later. So Henry is the second child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He's got two younger sisters who also have heirs. Some of them have male heirs. So there are other claimants to the throne running around out there. Some of their names may be familiar for those of you who know history, like This Is Where the Greys Come From for Jane Grey. So Henry is dealing with the threat of other claimants to the throne if he doesn't have a good, strong heir to pass his throne to. We talked about the theology issue already. The other thing that is easy to forget is Henry's not asking for something pie in the sky. other royalty and nobles have been able to get divorces. The Pope has granted them recently in Henry's immediate circle. Because, and actually we were just talking about this in the last class I was attending, the teacher's in here now, because a betrothal has a legal standing. You have to get that betrothal taken care of, especially for royalty. Somebody has to sever that before you can marry someone else. So Henry has seen it happen. In 1514, the Pope invalidates a marriage contract between Henry's baby sister, Mary Tudor, and Charles V. Henry's good buddy, Charles Brandon, in 1515, gets his previous marriage declared invalid so that he can marry someone else. Another pope grants Henry's other sister in 1527 a divorce from Archibald Douglas so she can marry Henry Stuart. Henry isn't asking for something way out of line. He has a decent reason to expect he might be able to obtain this divorce and get to marry someone who can give him an heir. However, Henry isn't totally sure which direction he's going yet at this point. And I want to bring that up because Henry is considering other options. It didn't have to go this way. One of the options that Henry considers is he does have an illegitimate son. The portrait of the woman is possibly a portrait of his mistress, Elizabeth Blunt. And the portrait of the young man is a portrait of his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. And so one of the things Henry seems to toy with is, can he get people to accept his illegitimate son as his heir to the point where he elevates Henry Fitzroy to the Duke of Richmond and bestows all kinds of titles on him in 1525. But then something additional happens. And that is he meets Anne Boleyn. So Henry has gone from the theoretical, I need an heir. I think getting out of this marriage might be the way to do it too. I have someone I pretty much falling for, and I think she can give me an heir. So now it becomes more pressing. And I think it's fair to say, and a lot of scholars have said this, Anne Boleyn doesn't cause the Reformation, but she is a catalyst. She is what finally pushes Henry to take certain actions. So Henry finally says, okay, I found this woman. This is the woman I want to marry when I get rid of Catherine of Aragon. And says to Cardinal Wolsey, by the way, all these guys in this portion are named Thomas. I don't know why. He says to Wolsey, get me that annulment that I've been asking for that everyone else knows is really a divorce. But Henry doesn't want to blame Catherine. Remember, she's a Spanish princess. You know, there is an alliance that he is damaging through this. So he doesn't want to blame Catherine. So instead, he blames the marriage. He says that dispensation that my father thought he got back in 1502, that must not have taken. And that's why God hasn't allowed us to have a son together. So Wolsey goes, okay, yes, sir, I'll do what you ask. He convenes an ecclesiastical court secretly to charge Henry with the violation of canon law by cohabitating with his brother's widow. Now, when I say to charge Henry, he basically calls Henry in and says, "Your Majesty, can I charge you with this?" And Henry says, "Yeah, sure." But Henry is not as clever as he wants to think. He thinks this is going to be great. This is going to get him what he wants. But there's a factor he's forgetting. Catherine of Aragon still has allies. And one of those allies notifies her and says, basically, they're trying to divorce you. And what Catherine has that these previous people who didn't want to be divorced didn't have is her nephew. So Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, is Catherine's nephew from her sister, Joanna of Castile. So there's two reasons that the Pope doesn't want to give Henry this annulment he's asking for. One of them is because the previous dispensation, the Pope saying, yeah, here's an annulment, it would bring into question the legitimacy of that previous Pope's decision. But probably far more important is that Charles V has the Pope under his thumb and has already sacked Rome once. So when the Pope has to do his calculation of who he wants to upset, he's way less worried about an angry Henry VIII over in England than an angry Charles V at the gates of Rome. But the Pope is willing to play politics for this because he recognizes it's not going to be a popular decision. So the Pope goes, okay, yeah, sure, we can do a trial. I'm going to send you this papal legate and he'll conduct the trial. This papal legate did everything except claim that the dog ate his homework. With the Pope's blessing. Oh, can't start the trial today. I'm not feeling well. Can't start it today. This other thing's going on. So the Pope sends the papal legate in 1528. Trial doesn't even start until 1529. And by then, Catherine and her supporters have had time to organize themselves. She actually goes in and testifies about her marriage to Arthur as well as Henry. But it drags and drags, and it actually never finishes. The Pope finally says to the papal legate, hey, I got something more important for you to be doing. Sorry, Henry, no annulment. And at this point, Henry's like, okay, we got to regroup here. First of all, Wolsey, you're out. You failed me. You didn't get me what I was asking for. So exit Wolsey. Wolsey, by the way, since we'll talk about the fates of everyone relevant here, Wolsey might have been okay, except that he keeps trying to get back in the king's graces, and he's eventually charged with treason. That is the risk with Henry VIII and this whole matter, is once you fail him, especially if you don't go away and keep your head down, you will probably end up in jail. And the only reason Wolsey isn't executed is because he dies on the way to the king. So, new plan. Henry has gotten 2 new assistants, also named Thomas. So, first of all, we have Thomas Cromwell. He takes over the job of getting Henry this divorce, and he has an able assistant in Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer will Cromwell and Cranmer will both come up a lot, still more. So they come up with a cunning new plan. And this cunning new plan is, we're going to separate the church from Rome. We're going to make Henry the head of the church, and then he can grant his own divorce. This is not about reform. These two actually end up being much more interested in reform than Henry is, but the purpose of this move is to get Henry what Henry wants, which is his annulment that everyone knows is divorce. There we go. I just need to remind myself what my next slide was. So I'm going to take a moment here before we go into what Henry's about to do and just talk to you about the medieval church in England so you understand the gravity of what Henry is about to embark on. So they claim that this is about a reform of the church because the divorce of Catherine of Aragon is wildly unpopular. So to set this stage, the church is shaping the lives of the people. You figure your calendar is based around the church. Your work year is based around a church. What days you don't have to work is all about the church. They are your source of news. They are in many cases your source of education, your source of healthcare. The church is a massive agent of economic control. About a quarter of all the land in England at this time in the late 1520s is owned by the church or church guilds and livery companies. They are your source of charity. They're a source of a lot of arbitration of disputes. It is extremely dangerous for your average person to disagree with the church. But you can see that even if they don't necessarily understand all of the theology, the church is a major factor in people's lives. It is shaping the world you live in. But a lot of people don't understand the beliefs. And this probably frames why some of these things are not necessarily a big deal to the people. The Mass is conducted in Latin behind a screen. Communion is only like 3 times a year. You have to confess once a year. You do not have a Bible in the vernacular. There's not an active lay participation. And even more than that, at this particular time, England is experiencing a shortage of priests. And they're having an additional problem with what they call pluralism. And what that means is that the money that they are getting from the land that's supposed to support the local priest isn't enough. So priests have to take on more and more places in order to have enough to live, which you see less of the local priest because he's busy in multiple places. You sometimes have friction because the priests are having to charge higher fees because they need to live. There are a small number of corrupt priests. Remember I said at the beginning, there's less corruption, but the corrupt priests that are out there are getting press. It's a known issue. There is a small sliver of the English population that has been calling for reform. But overall, your average English person in the early 16th century has a life that is still largely revolving around the church, regardless of how fervent their religious belief is. It is something that shapes their lives. So with that in mind, we enact our plan, the Thomases and Henry. So, first of all, Cromwell brings a petition of grievances against the church to Parliament, and this is called the Supplication against the Ordinaries. And then next is the Bishop of Hereford presents Henry VIII's demands for how the church needs to change at the Convocation of Canterbury. Basically, it is a gathering of the clergy. And what Henry wants, he wants the current church to renounce the authority to make church law, otherwise known as canons, without royal permission. He wants the church to submit all existing church law to a committee that is going to be half members of parliament, half clergy, that can then void any existing church law that they, parentheses Henry, finds unacceptable. So they're only going to keep the church law that Henry is good with. And the other thing we're going to do is we are going to abolish these payments that happen regularly from the clergy to the papal treasury. And we're going to change the election of bishops. So the chapter's still going to elect the bishop, but they're legally required to elect the candidate the king has already chosen. Just realized this is getting in my way. So we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to have the Ecclesiastical Appeals Act, which is another Cromwell special. And this is all part of the design of putting Henry at the top of the church. So we are going to declare England to be an empire. And they're meaning this in the idea of like the Roman Empire, and the basic idea being that no one is above the head of the empire, the imperial crown. They're going to say the crown is the final legal authority for all legal matters, whether it's ecclesiastical or secular, and there is no appeal to anyone beyond the king. So you can't go to the Pope anymore. So and then we have, again, more things about money, abolishing more payments to Rome. And now we're going to say the Archbishop of Canterbury has the power to issue the dispensations that used to come from the Pope. So we are setting the stage for Henry to be the head of the church. And really at this point, just to understand the structure, this is my super simple diagram, but Henry's goal at this time is, you see in the triangles that everything below the top line is the same, because all Henry is really looking to do right now is bump the Pope out of that top spot and put himself in instead. He's not interested in otherwise restructuring the church. He doesn't change a lot of those other things. It's just a matter of who's in charge ultimately. And we get, because things have become more urgent, because now Anne Boleyn is pregnant near the end of 1532. So we finally get to the Act of Supremacy. If you don't remember any of the other acts, remember the Act of Supremacy, because the Act of Supremacy says the crown is the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Bye-bye, Pope. Now it's the English crown. And the crown now gets everything, whether it's honors, money, privileges, whatever, all of those things that used to go to the Pope, they all go to the crown. And then the Treasons Act, which goes hand in hand with your Act of Supremacy, which says it's treason not to recognize the act of supremacy, as well as not to recognize the First Succession Act, which I put on the bottom, which says that it kicks Mary out of the line of succession, puts Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's children in, and requires the subjects to swear an oath of supremacy that they recognize the act and the king's supremacy if they're asked to. Because with those rights given to the Archbishop of Canterbury on the previous slide, Cranmer has now annulled Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and Henry marries Anne Boleyn. And also, to break things up, here is an actual period document of the oath of allegiance to Henry VIII and his successors, with the signatures of nobles who were forced to sign it. And I'm going to stop for a second and have a drink. So, I mean, obviously we do get some woodcuts because we are now in the era of woodcut propaganda, which is some of my favorite. So here is a woodcut illustration illustrating what Henry has done. So this man laying on the floor, that is the Pope. You can actually see some of his regalia laying down here. So he is now on the floor with Henry with his foot pushing down on him, and they're labeled in case you are literate, just so you're totally clear on what you're seeing. You see we have the weeping monks down here in the corner, and more protests. We have different people protesting. And right here, standing next to Henry, handing him the materials he needs for this, there's Cranmer and there's Cromwell. This is also where we get our first two martyrs of the Reformation. The first two really big objections come from Thomas More and then a bishop named John Fisher, and they end up being executed. And particularly the execution of More results in an outcry to the point that in the Second Succession Act, criticizing More's execution actually becomes a treasonous offense. Don't question Henry. He knows what's good for you. And we get more woodcut propaganda. Here we have the execution of John Fisher, Thomas More, and Margaret Pole as well. So for a little while after this, Henry gets his first marriage. He doesn't yet know that Anne Boleyn isn't going to give him that son he so desperately desires. Meanwhile, over here, Cranmer and Cromwell are actually starting to lay the foundation of what will actually be different about the Church of England. They start coming out with what is referred to as the Injunctions. So writing out what the clergy should teach. What are the tenets of the Church of England? They are writing the bishop's book, which is explaining the new doctrine, and they're already updating the Injunctions. So you do have people laying down that basis for what the Church of England will be, but it's not something that Henry puts a lot of time into. It's not something that he's really deeply involved in the way that Edward, his son, will be involved. But then Henry decides he needs money because it's time to fight more wars. So we just talked about a couple minutes ago how important the religious houses and the church are to the life of the English people, and such a source of, healthcare or education or charity. Henry looks at the monasteries and decides that, well, if they're his now, and look at all that money they have, look at all that land, look at all that wealth, look at all of the things that have been donated to them, I could really use that money. And so Henry begins what is referred to as the dissolution of the monasteries. So you have over 800 religious houses that are dismantled. So you close the religious house, you seize their assets, and then you redistribute the estates either to the crown or you give them to your loyal supporters. So Henry gives them to new nobles. This is massively unpopular with the people. And what Henry doesn't realize, because even the leading thinkers of the day don't realize, is England is in an economic crisis. They didn't have this language yet to talk about it. They didn't understand economic theory the same way we do. England has experienced a population explosion in the early 16th century, and they are suffering from massive unemployment already. And what we are going to add to that is we're going to take away these religious institutions that have been providing support for people who are suffering from this economic crisis. And we're going to add like 12,000 more people who are now also unemployed and have nowhere to live. So it is a religious change, but imagine the economic and social impact of what Henry is doing. But you don't have the words to articulate it. You don't have the same understanding of economics in that time that we do now. All of the people who can't work are just being blamed for being lazy, or that they're not really trying hard enough. There's not that same appreciation of how these factors interact. So as a result of the dissolution of the monasteries, you have Henry's big major rebellion that's related to the Reformation. And this is known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. This occurs in 1536 towards the north of England, which has always been more staunchly Catholic. So the thinking of the Pilgrimage of Grace, though, they don't blame Henry. They don't blame the king. What the Pilgrimage of Grace's thought process is, the king has bad advisors. If the king understood, how much we're being hurt, and how much we really don't want these changes, he wouldn't be making them. So, we're going to have this uprising to try to get his attention and to purge those bad advisors, those heretics that are in government. So this is about 40,000 people strong. And you see it starts mostly from monasteries, but there's little colored lines on there to show the different groups. So the Pilgrimage of Grace basically says we want the dissolution of the monasteries stop. We want an end to taxes and subsidies that are really hurting us. We want to stop changes in land laws. There were enclosures going on. There were things where people were losing access to public grazing land. We want our rents to be fairer, and we want to get rid of these heretics that are in the government. And at least the way they articulated it is, surely Henry VIII, once he sees what is going on, he's going to change it. And instead, Henry suppresses the rebellion, though not as violently as he could, executes the leaders, and basically, sends everybody off. He hangs a bunch of clergy, and he continues, and the last monastery in England is closed in 1541. But Henry's got other things to focus on now, because he now has to deal with getting rid of Anne Boleyn, which she doesn't have to invoke anything specific to, the Reformation to do that. He trumps up charges of, adultery and everything. So he finds another wife, which is Jane Seymour, who finally gives him that long desired son that he's been waiting for. So he needs another succession act, because now he has to say that Elizabeth, his child with Anne, is illegitimate, and that his marriage to Jane Seymour is now valid. So it's treason to question the legitimacy of Jane Seymour's marriage to him or Edward, his child. You also can't say that either the previous marriages were legitimate or the offspring were legitimate. And again, he can make you swear an oath that you recognize the succession. And if you interrupt the succession, you forfeit any claim you have to the throne. And then, just as a side note, so you know what happened, we also get Cromwell in here. Once Jane Seymour dies, after giving birth to Edward, Cromwell brings about his own downfall, because he is the one who negotiates the marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves. That does not go well. Henry is unimpressed, and that ends Cromwell's influence. We have the brief marriage to Catherine Howard that ends in her execution for adultery. And then Henry gets married to Catherine Parr. And the last major act we're going to mention here is just that, again, he has to redo the succession, because he has to make it so that Edward is still first, but after that, it would be any child Henry and Catherine Parr had, any child that Henry might have with a yet seventh wife or more. And he puts Mary and Elizabeth back into the succession, but not 100%. They are only allowed to succeed with some provisos. That there's some things that would make them not quite as legitimate, because he really doesn't think it'll ever get to them. And just to add to a final layer of chaos, when Henry is dying in 1547, he changes the succession yet again in a will where he says, okay, the succession is going to be Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth, then the Grey sisters that we talked about before. And the will is stamped but not signed. But we have an eldest son. The crown does pass to Edward VI, but in some ways we've brought about exactly what Henry feared. He does have a male heir, but he is a young heir who is not old enough to rule on his own and ends up with a regency. I will take a drink just a moment. I know it gets a little dry, literally, as in the material is not always as exciting as it could be, and dry as in it's winter. And you'll notice we have just spent a massive amount of time on the Henry part of this. Because a lot of the rest of what we're going to talk about is dealing with the aftermath of what Henry has done. And there actually, I can't find it. There was a quote from one of the historians I read who said that a great deal of early modern English history is dealing with the aftermath of Henry VIII's reign and just sorting out everything that he caused to occur. So again, Henry has now keeled over. No offense, I'm a little irreverent sometimes. Henry has keeled over. His son, Edward VI, is crowned king, but he's young. So he has a regency council. The regency council is all Protestant and is made up by the Protestant faction in Henry's court. And that's going to be really important because what we're going to see in the Edwardian Reformation is that you're going to get a definite push from people who are actually interested in seeing a Protestant Reformation in England. They're no longer doing it just to get the king his divorce that he wants. So, by the way, Cranmer is still around. Cranmer plays an important role under Edward. But their plan is they are going to use this regency to establish that Protestant church here. And you have the lovely, here's the allegory of the Reformation for you. So here is Henry on his deathbed, giving his blessing for everything to continue in the same direction with his son. And then you have his son's advisors over here. And if you, like me, do not instantly recognize them all, next to him are the members of this Regency Council. Standing up is Edward Seymour, as in Jane's brother. So his uncle. Then we have, Cranmer. And you can see in the background, out the window back here, the smashing of Catholic things, basically, we'll just call it. And there is a lot of destruction that happened during that dissolution of the monasteries. Some purposeful, as in, destroying Catholic icons. Some of it, just a side effect of closing down the monasteries. And again, you still have the Pope down here, and the Pope and the monks are kind of being continuing to be pushed out of England. So, first of all, there is evidence that despite his young age, Edward VI was fully on board with this Protestant Reformation plan. He appears to be a young man who thought of himself as very pious and actually did firmly believe in the importance of this reform. So one of the first acts once he is king is he repeals the Treasons Acts under his father and gets rid of the new felonies that were created under his father. However, we put denying the supremacy of the crown over the Church of England right back in as a treason. And we spell out all the different ways that it's treason. You can't deny it in speech. It's even worse to deny it in writing. You can't deny the legitimacy of the crown or the heirs. You can't interrupt the succession. But treason does require 2 witnesses now. And while this is going on, Cranmer's are the last guy standing from Henry's reign, who's really important here. He is working on the first book of homilies, which is a set of sermons. We're working on the Book of Common Prayer, and these things are all to replace what was previously provided through the Catholic Church. The Book of Common Prayer is going to be our liturgical book. It's going to have our calendar. What are our morning and evening prayers? What are the sacraments we're going to maintain? So some of this is a continuation of Cromwell and Cranmer's work under Henry, but he's given much more leave to work on it and is much more a mission of this reign to come up with all of these things. However, the big problem is that we're still in an economic crisis. We're still struggling. Not everyone is happy with these religious changes. So in 1549, there is a group of unconnected in the sense of a lot of communication between them. There are 3 different significant uprisings in England that against Edward. And the causes vary. I mean, they are all to some extent about economics and about religion. So, sorry, I flipped the page wrong. Because trust me, I don't remember all this off the top of my head. Yeah. So you have a rising in Cornwall and Devon, what is referred to as the Prayer Book Rebellion. And this rebellion explicitly states that it is in part in response to this release of the Book of Common Prayer, which is identified as the only legal form of worship in England when it comes out in 1549. And there are severe penalties for clergy who try to use anything else, up to and including life imprisonment. So the Prayer Book Rebellion, it's about 7,000 people, largely gentry and lower classes from the areas of Cornwall and Devon. 2,000 of them die this summer. Then in Buckingham and Oxfordshire, we also have a rebellion. We don't have as much information about this one. We know there were about 200 executions. This is mostly farmers, artisans, and parish priests. But again, they're rebelling against economic issues as well as protesting the religious changes. And then the largest one is out of Norfolk, it is about 16,000 people, mostly farmers and peasants. At least 3,000 of them die. There's a massacre associated with Kett's rebellion. And some of their desires, they say they want the restoration of the Latin Mass. They want to go back to, not all the way back to the Catholic way of doing things necessarily, but they want to go back to the articles and some of the tenets that were published under Henry VIII, rather than these new things that are coming out with Edward. They want the monasteries restored, and they want some of their rituals back, as well as those services that the monasteries used to provide, like education and hospitals. And then add to the religious rebels, you have economic rebels. And to give you a better picture, we are now at 1549. We're about halfway through. The population explosion is still a factor. Inflation has gotten higher. Rent and food are going up. The estimate is that real purchasing power in England has declined 40% from 1500 to 1560. The wool trade has largely collapsed because continental Europe isn't buying because they're engaged in their own wars, increased migrancy, and the effect, you now have the effect of the dissolution on the English people. The economy has just not been flexible enough to handle all these new unemployed people, as well as the loss of all of the services that the monasteries provided. So the rebellions not only get put down, but they cause the fall of Seymour as the head of the regency, because he actually hesitates because he is sympathetic to the rebels, which ultimately will end in his execution later, because he tries to plot to regain power. So the next person to rise to power is John Dudley. And John Dudley decides he is going to go all in on Protestantism because it's what Edward VI wants. So he is going to go even harder on this Protestant train to get in good with the king. Because Edward's not going to be a minor forever. Eventually, there isn't going to be a regency anymore. But even if there's not a regency anymore, if he's in good with Edward, he can still be a trusted advisor. Does the name Dudley sound familiar to anyone? All right. Well, it works. Dudley manages it because when Edward does fall sick and he has to write up the quote unquote device for the succession, which in fact, this is part of it here from it. This is a manuscript that still exists. So he has to write down what he wants to happen when he dies. And this is intended to supersede his father's third act of succession. And Dudley managed to convince him that if he wants his Protestant mission to continue, and he wants to keep England on the track to being Protestant, he needs to skip over his sister Mary and instead name as heirs his cousins, the Grey sisters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary. Now, remember just a minute ago when I said the name Dudley should be familiar? Jane Grey is betrothed to Guildford Dudley, Dudley's son. So he has managed to navigate himself into a position where Dudley thinks that if Edward passes away, he is going to be the father of a king consort and probably the grandfather of a king, is set. And because, again, your relationship is Frances Brandon is the daughter of Henry's youngest sister, Mary. So Jane, Catherine, and Mary are the granddaughters, which is why they have a very close claim to the throne. However, let me go back for a second. However, we know that this, in fact, doesn't work out. The Protestant faction really wants Jane Grey as queen. But for reasons of various political machinations, like Mary Tudor just plain getting to London first and managing to convince the members of the Privy Council who are present, Mary Tudor comes out on top. And Jane Grey is only queen for about 9 days. But Mary doesn't execute Jane Grey at this point, or her husband, Guildford Dudley. And I think that's important to remember. So right now, she imprisons her rival, and Mary becomes Queen of England. Now, everybody knows Mary is Catholic. Remember Mary's history. She is half Spanish. Her mother was Catherine of Aragon. She has not been integrated into court life the way a normal princess would have been, because of her father delegitimizing her and taking her out of the succession and putting her back in and taking her out and putting her in. So she feels a much stronger affinity to her Spanish ancestry. And I think it also is why she sometimes makes decisions that don't necessarily make sense to us. She has not had the same preparations for becoming a ruler that you would have otherwise expected if her father had actually intended her to be his heir. So Mary gets going on 2 major things. One of those things is reversing what her father and brother have done, hence the Marian Restoration. And the other thing is dealing with getting married. So first of all, Mary gets in there. First statute to repeal. All that religious legislation my brother passed, gone. Doesn't exist anymore. New Treasons Act. All of the treasons created under my father, gone. All the felonies created under my father, gone. Second statute to repeal. Any religious legislation against the papacy from 1529 to the end of Henry VIII's reign, gone, except we don't give up the supremacy. Mary retains the crown as the supreme head of the English church. She doesn't give that up. Then the next thing we do is we revive the Heresy Acts from prior to Henry VIII. Now we have all of those Heresy Act tools again at our disposal to proceed with our plan of dealing with the heretics that are now infecting England. And yes, I am using the kind of language she probably was. She also gets help. The Pope is so excited that there is now a Catholic ruler on the throne of England again, he actually sends Cardinal Reginald Pole to assist her in the restoration. But there's that second detail now, and that is Mary has to deal with getting married. So I think it's fair to say that Mary was not the most eligible bachelorette in England or on the European continent because of everything going on with her father delegitimizing her, re-legitimizing her. She was out of succession. She was in succession. She was not a good marriage bet, which is why Mary ascends the throne, never having been married, and has suddenly gone from, who cares if you have an heir, to, if you don't have an heir, your sister's going to inherit the throne and she's going to undo everything you're doing. So Mary needs an heir stat. And the truth is, there really aren't a lot of eligible bachelors running around for Mary. I've given you a portrait of the one who was considered most eligible. This is Edward Courtenay, the first Earl of Devon. And everything I've read about him, he just kind of sounds like a tool. Nobody seemed real impressed with him who might have to marry him. The other thing is, again, back to Mary's history, she has been largely excluded from the English court. She has much more affinity to her Spanish family. So Mary sets her eye on Philip II, soon to be Philip II of King of Spain. And that's who she would like to marry. So she's going to marry a Spanish Catholic king, prince at the time. No one is happy. Nobody likes this plan. Nobody is happy. Nobody is pleased with it, to the point that we have a rebellion about it. And that rebellion happens to line up with religious affiliation too. So in 1554, we have something called Wyatt's Rebellion that is a direct response to Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain. The primary leaders are all Protestants. There's Sir Thomas Wyatt, who it's named for, Sir James Croft, Sir Peter Carew, and Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk. Grey. So again, like I said, Mary was actually pretty merciful initially on the question of Jane Grey. Other notable rebels involved: two of her uncles, two of Jane Grey's uncles, Thomas Grey and John Grey. So their big plan that they're going to go forth with is they're going to start rebellions in multiple counties at the same time. And then they're all going to march on London. They're going to depose Mary. They're going to crown Elizabeth as her successor. And then they're going to marry Elizabeth off to Edward Courtenay. And France is going to provide naval support for this whole operation. The reason this doesn't get off the ground is because the Holy Roman Empire's ambassador hears about it, contacts Stephen Gardner in this shot, and people start getting arrested before anything can fully happen. They try to go forward with part of the rebellion. Well, some of them do. Some of them run away. Wyatt gets the furthest. He actually takes some cities and marches on London, but the citizens of London actually rise up and manage to push him off. And one of the biggest things about this is that Elizabeth gets interrogated and is kept imprisoned and seems at real risk of possibly being executed by her sister. The other thing is, once Jane Grey's father and two uncles are both implicated, this is what finally leads Mary to execute Jane Grey and her husband. So I think it would be fair to say at this point in things that Mary is not wildly popular. So she does take some of this to heart. There actually has to be a specific act passed by Parliament that regulates the precise relationship between Mary and Philip with regards to England, because the big fear here is that Philip's going to marry Mary and then try to take control of England from there. So however they might have felt about Mary as the daughter of Henry VIII before, her marriage to Philip is a massive blow to her popularity with the English people. Meanwhile, just to help matters, the Pope actually issues a papal bull saying, yay, Philip and Mary are the King and Queen of England, and we would like them to get to work on getting us restitution of everything that was confiscated during the dissolution. And the other thing the papal bull says is, whatever happens, Elizabeth shouldn't be the successor. So, marriage out of the way, not wildly popular at this point. Mary embarks on her religious policies with the help of able advisors like Reginald Pole. And our plan is we're going to release the Catholics who are imprisoned for their religion. We're going to imprison Protestant churchmen, which is how we finally get to the end of Thomas Cranmer. We're going to reinstate things like celibacy for priests. We're going to reestablish the relationship of England with the Pope. And we're going to persecute Protestants until they relent and agree to be Catholic again, or we have to kill them. Now, as a caveat here, in fairness to Mary, she really doesn't end up executing on average any more people than, say, her sister, but she does it in such a short time. And the thing is, despite all of this, so again, imagine living through this and seeing all this chaos. Despite all of this, here's another woodcut propaganda of burning at the stake. There are historians who have pretty convincingly argued that Mary might have succeeded in bringing England back to Catholicism had she not died when she did. That the English people weren't necessarily all that resistant to that return to Catholicism. So after a series of false pregnancies with no heir, Mary does pass away. And we can get to our final chapter, which is the Elizabethan Reformation under Elizabeth I. So in some ways, there's not as much exciting about Elizabeth I's Elizabethan settlement, because it is a lot of, she issues a new act of supremacy, which clarifies what heresy is, confirms her as the supreme, we're no longer head, now we're the governor of the Church of England, which may have had to do with her gender as much as it did, any other kind of semantics. We still got an oath. We have a new oath of supremacy. We can't assert the authority of any foreign entity. We have a new act of uniformity that nullifies the statute of repeal. We restore a lot of the religious legislation from Edward VI, including things like the Book of Common Prayer. Elizabeth puts into laws that are not repealed things like the Book of Common Prayer being the only acceptable form of worship, what the order of prayer should be, what services should look like. And in the Act of Uniformity, she makes church attendance compulsory, but if you don't go, it's a small fine. If you go to Catholic Mass, that's a large fine. She's much more concerned with you actively going to a Catholic Mass that's forbidden than she is with you skipping church in general. And a priest who is giving Mass faces an even harsher punishment. And really, for the first couple years of her reign, Elizabeth is not terribly concerned about your personal internal beliefs. What she wants is outward compliance. You attend church when you're supposed to. You don't go to Catholic Mass. And she makes a statement at one point that she's not trying to regulate people's hearts and minds. What she's interested in is that you're following the rules and you're not doing Catholic things that are against the rules. We reinstitute the royal injunctions, which are the regulations for religion. We revise the Book of Common Prayer. We have yet more doctrines of faith. We make rules about how ministers are ordained. We create another book of sermons. There's a lot of work of setting up what this new Church of England looks like and picking through what was done under Edward and pulling some of that back and then filling in the blanks. So by the time Elizabeth is done with these laws, we know what the structure and form is of the Church of England. However, what Elizabeth is still dealing with is that there is still opposition to her because she is a Protestant. And there are still multiple plans to depose her. And the new darling of the Catholics is now Mary, Queen of Scots. That is the new rival for the throne. She is Elizabeth's Catholic cousin. So we have one rebellion. We have the Rising of the North, which happens in 1569. This has a bunch of names. It's the Revolt of the Northern Earls. It's the Northern Rebellion. Notice a lot of these rebellions come out of the North. Their plan is, again, depose Elizabeth, crown Mary, and then marry Mary off to the fourth Duke of Norfolk, which is Thomas Howard. And Elizabeth I ends up having to declare martial law and execute about 750 people over this. Add fuel to the fire. In 1570, the Pope actually issues a papal bull that excommunicates Elizabeth for heresy and her persecution of Catholics, says to her subjects, you don't have to have allegiance to her. As a matter of fact, if you don't deny allegiance to Elizabeth I, you're excommunicated too. On the heels of this, we have the Ridolfi plot, which is yet another plan. Now we're specifically not just saying we're going to depose Elizabeth, we're going to assassinate her, crown Mary, Mary to Thomas Howard. We're going to do this with the assistance of the Spanish and the Netherlands, and we're going to incite a rebellion alongside it. And this leads to, like I said, Elizabeth initially, she makes those laws and it's just kind of like, okay, make the show, go to church, do what you're supposed to. Well, you end up as a response with things like this. This is actually a page from a pamphlet that was put out in 1579, which is, here are what Catholic religious items look like, so that you can recognize them if you see them being smuggled into the country, and you can properly report them and deal with them. So new laws are being put into effect in response to these rebellions and plots. In 1581, we have another plot. The plot is, yet again, to depose Elizabeth and crown Mary Queen of Scots via a Spanish invasion. In this time frame, the Pope also encourages Philip II to dethrone Elizabeth, and actually gives a guy a ship and money to land in Ireland and launch an invasion from there, and they take the money and run. And then we have the Babington plot from 1586, which is, stop me if you've heard this one, we're going to depose Elizabeth and crown Mary Queen of Scots via a Spanish invasion. This is the one that they finally connect Mary Queen of Scots to and directly leads to her execution. So in response to these things, you get more and more severe punishments for anything associated with Catholicism. In 1584, you get an act against Jesuits, where Roman Catholic priests are basically banished from England. You either have to leave or you have to swear an oath of allegiance. If you have been educated abroad in a Jewish seminary, you have to come back now within 6 months and swear an oath pretty much as soon as you get here. And even if you take the oath, you can't be within 10 miles of the Queen for the next 10 years. Now, remember, it was just a fine for not going to church back then. Now, by 1592, you can be imprisoned for not attending church, or convincing others not to attend church, or attending illegal religious meetings. And now there are fines for if you know someone is a recusant, which is a Catholic who is refusing to convert. And then we have a Popish Recusants Act, 1592. Now you can't move more than 5 miles from home if you're Catholic. And if you do, we can take away your stuff. So you see how the structure of the church may be finally established by the end, but we're still sorting out how everybody feels about it and sorting out what this is going to mean. And in my notes, I noted that all these different things that the Catholics keep upping the ante, because they firmly believe that it's a problem for Elizabeth to be queen. They're not doing it just to be jerks. There is a firmly held belief. So by the end of Elizabeth's reign, Church of England has a structure, but we are still working through what all of that means long term and what it's going to look like, and working through the emotional portion of what does it mean that England is now the Church of England and not part of the Catholic Church. So thank you all for your patience. I know it was a ton of information. So if people have questions or you want to talk more about something, please feel free. You can type something in the chat. You can turn on your mic and talk to me. I am happy to help.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I hope it was interesting. The plan is when I have to do it live, I'm going to have a felt board so that I can still have some visual aids. And I definitely plan on having like removable heads and things like that. Definitely some flames for the people who get burned at the stake, just to make it more visually interesting. Thank you all for coming. I hope you all aren't so full with your brains that you have nothing more you can do today, because it was a lot of brain.
I have a question coming.
Yes.
I'm putting it in the chat room.
Okay. What if anything, I've read a little bit about Tyndale, but I don't feel like I know enough to answer it yet.
Well, let me bring it up here. This is actually a reproduction of the 1526 New Testament.
Awesome.
Now, it's funny you mentioned the sheep where they had Catholic artifacts that were smuggled in.
Yes.
These were smuggled in from, I believe, Geneva, Switzerland, in sections and then sewn together in England.
The amount of subterfuge in some cases involved in some of the smuggling is fascinating. The way I
agree. One of the things that I learned, I used to work for a Christian bookstore, and I was the Bible charge of the Bible department, so I had to train everyone in the brief history of the Bible. There was a Catholic bishop, Cuthbert Tunstall.
Yep.
Who pretty much funded the second edition of the Tyndale New Testament by bribes and buying of the Tyndale first editions, which only 6 or 5, roughly.
There is a portrait of, I believe it is Cuthbert. I'd have to look in the class I do on English prayer beads, where it's a portrait of him, and the way his hands are positioned, it's almost certain that he was painted with the rosary in his hands and the beads were later painted out. To sanitize him to keep that portrait up in the family home.
Which is interesting from the English Reformation. I think it's Collins who does the stories of, we did a story of hymns and Christmas carols and the 12 Days of Christmas is actually a Catholic catechism.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I would be very interested because, like I said,
let me grab the book.
I know there's a lot I still don't know. But trying to explain prayer beads led to, I got to learn more about this subject, because you actually, in the late 16th century, you get mentions of, what's your evidence that this person is a recusant? Oh, well, he makes the boxes that rosaries go in. And there's a real interesting relationship where rosaries are one of them. There's a couple other things where those particular things get identified as very, very Catholic.
Oh, no,
Oh,
stories.
cool. Yeah.
There's 2 editions of this one, yeah, but I don't know if you can still get it for $10, but they were 16.
Stories behind the best love songs of Christmas. Yeah. And like I said, there is so much more. I mean, I cut a lot of people, I cut a lot of political intrigue just to get it into okay, if you know this, you at least have a good idea of how the Reformation occurred in England.
I mean, you are correct. It is rather
Extensive.
extensive, and I'm not trying to be against anything Anglican, because I know people that are Anglican. It's still probably still working out.
Oh, and it's interesting to me that, post period, you've come back to things like now there's an Anglican rosary. There've just been shifts in it, but don't worry, I was raised Lutheran. A lot of this stuff was completely strange to me when I started out.
Well, I was probably raised even farther from it, being apostolic Christian, not Pentecostal, like really fundamental, almost like Mennonite kind of thing.
Yeah. But yeah, for people who really didn't understand it at all, I'm like, this is your basics. And then you can go dig into, I mean, there are whole debates on what it meant and didn't mean to the English people and how much they noticed, how much they cared.
And it's interesting because actually King James, James VI of England, King James the First, the King James, he actually liked the Bible the Puritans liked, but didn't like the footnotes.
Yeah. Well, and when I teach, the other thing I sometimes add, I'm really excited. We're going to go to Jamestown later this year, is, they've found things like what they think is a rosary bead or two and some crosses that are very Catholic looking in excavations in Jamestown.
That would not be surprising.
Yeah.
Because there's still Catholicism in England today.
Right. But at that time, it was much less acceptable than it would be now. And that is the other thing I emphasize when I teach about this is, by the end of period, things like beads, they're going out into the colonies that people have.
Probably not with the Puritans.
Probably not with them, but definitely down in the other English colonies, there's information about them. And they're probably going Spanish
colonies other than Maryland.
Yeah, and they're going with the Spanish.
Yeah.
Because I'm totally into beads. That's my other obsession, as other people who know me on here know. But yeah, it is fascinating, and this will continue to get revised and changed and updated. Still trying to figure out how to present some of it without feeling like I'm droning, but at the same time, you need to know it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep working on that.
It'd be interesting to be able to teach again in the history of the English Bible, just the medieval Bibles.
Oh, yeah.
Because, it's like St. Bede from around 700.
Yes.
Did several translations. There's some from around 1,000, and many of them were destroyed actually by the Catholic Church. I'm not saying that to criticize the Catholic Church, it's just
No.
a historical fact.
Well, and I have met someone who does a late English persona, and will actually do, little gatherings for people who are interested, where he'll actually go through. He'll basically demo this is what a prayer service would have actually looked like using the Book of Common Prayer in 1550 something, and just really explore what it would have looked like and sounded like.
It was interesting, but it was a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to my other silent attendees, and I hope everybody has a great day.